Um, I'm going to introduce the work that I've been doing looking at the implications of the Freedom of Information request which I made around the assumptions in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. But also on top of that, some recent publications, the Carbon Budget Delivery Plan, which is the update to the net zero strategy, and also the zero emission vehicle mandate. So I'm going to take you through what I think that means for some of the factors which Steve and Ivo were just pointing out. So the storyline doesn't go back all that far. The sixth carbon budget was only December 2020, so it's not yet 3 years old. The decarbonising transport plan is not yet 2 years old. So some of the changes that I'll talk about today are pretty stark, I would say, in the light of the limited timescales that we've had between publication and where we are now. And I think that just reflects how difficult this decarbonisation challenge really is. So this was the subject of my Freedom of Information request. This is the domestic transport policy pathways which were included in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, but nowhere in the plan was it spelt out what had been assumed in order for any of the green or indeed blue baseline policy pathways to come about. So I asked for 3 simple pieces of information: the levels of road traffic by car, LGV and HGV, the proportion of those miles that would be driven in zero emission vehicles, and an explanation for the assumptions around the divergence which resulted from the short-term COVID-19 uncertainty. So the kind of 25 to 30 megaton variation that kind of starts at the beginning of the green slope. About 9 or 10 months after I requested that information and went through a series of different appeals, I did eventually get hold of it. So that's going to form the backdrop to the analysis that I show in a bit. But let's just start with where we've gone with our carbon ambition. So this line here shows the budgets which were set out in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, in the Net Zero Strategy, and in the Committee on Climate Change's 6th carbon budget. So the green lines are essentially the edges of the fuzzy green area that you just saw on the previous chart, but out to 2037 rather than out to 2050. So they're quite wide lines. The grey lines are the pathways which were set out in the Net Zero Strategy, which already suggests that some of the more extreme scenarios that were included in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan weren't really part of core government strategy. And then the red line is how those compare with the Committee on Climate Change's 6th carbon budget. So really you have to be tracking closer to the more ambitious end of the net zero strategy in order to be consistent with the 6th carbon budget. Now, what was published in March this year on Bring Out the Trash Day was the Carbon Budget Delivery Plan, which was the government's response to the legal appeal on the net zero strategy, which required them to provide greater transparency on the pathways forward. And what they published there was a set of indicative budgets for domestic transport in the 5-year periods, which is I've interpolated to be the blue dash line that's on the chart there. So actually you can see it's now tracking above the least ambitious part of the net zero strategy, and it's well above the Committee on Climate Change's 6th carbon budget. So essentially what's being said in that strategy is that we are downgrading the level of ambition which domestic transport emission reduction is going to play in our whole of government strategy. If you look at what was set out in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, then the grey area there represents 72% of the area in between the 2 green lines. So basically 72% of the ambition in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan has been said to not be necessary at this stage in order to deliver our whole government climate change emission goals. Now that will come as a bit of a surprise to most people. It's the slowest to decarbonise sector, but it's also the largest sector in the economy. And we're saying that we are going to push some of that ambition elsewhere in the economy. Now, if you happen to be a local authority that's declared zero emissions in 2030, or indeed 2038 or 2040, then you can begin to see a very large gap between what you thought you were doing and what the national government is saying it is going to support. So why have we seen that ambition diminish? Well, in order to do this, I built a model a bit, I was going to say a bit like Ivo's model. It's not a bit like Ivo's model at all. It's really simple spreadsheet model. And it's got, for some reason, one of my animations hasn't worked, but it's got some fairly simple inputs to it. So if we know the proportion of miles traveled, well, we know the total miles traveled or forecast to be traveled by cars, LGVs and HGVs. So you can put whatever assumptions you want in there, national road traffic projections, transport decarbonisation plan, etc. If we know the proportion of those which are estimated to be traveled in zero emission vehicles, so again, you can use whatever set of assumptions you want in there. You can work out the proportion of miles which will then be left over for fossil fuel vehicles. You can then apply assumptions on the overall efficiency changes to those remaining fossil fuel vehicle miles, and that will give you the essentially the leftover surface transport emissions. Plus you have to add in bus, rail and other, all of which are relatively small. But I've made a set of assumptions about that. One thing that's different about my model to the TDP, I've just made all of these assumptions available on a spreadsheet. So if anyone doesn't agree with them, I'm happy to have better assumptions, and it's quite simple to put them through the model. What I would say is this is the assumptions on the relative efficiencies of the whole fleet compared to 2018 levels. So you can see that the car fleet, the fossil fuel car fleet, is assumed to be overall about a 10% improvement in efficiency, but more for HGVs and LGVs, more than 20% improvement in total fleet efficiency. And I'll come back to the kind of importance of those assumptions as was implied by Ivo and Steve. I've calibrated this model to data that was published around the national road traffic projections. I had to make some small adjustments to the efficiencies, which is essentially how you calibrate this model. And I've managed to reproduce it with a couple of validations, all within 1% of what the DFT produces. So I'm going to say it's reasonable enough for strategic policy analysis. I was quite pleased with that. So why has ambition been downgraded? So this is what was revealed from the Transport Decarbonisation Plan in terms of the road traffic projection envelope. So you can see that we've gone from an envelope which actually included an overall reduction in road traffic across the entire period out to 2040. That's the most ambitious end of the spectrum, to one which was very high growth, which corresponds to a world in which there are connected autonomous vehicles and large amounts of electrification and so on. The black line is the Committee on Climate Change's pathway. Now, in some senses, this is a bit of a masterstroke of policy planning, because it's difficult to imagine any road traffic policy future that doesn't sit somewhere in between these two lines, one which includes very rapid connected autonomous vehicles and electrification, and one which includes a decline in road traffic. So it's difficult to say you wouldn't somehow meet this part of the plan. But what's happened since then that means that we no longer think that the bottom end of this is realistic. So the publication in December of last year of the National Road Traffic Projections included a whole range of different potential scenarios, and you can see them all posted on here. So the red dashed dot line is the NRTP low economy scenario. The grey line is the core scenario. The red line is the high economic growth scenario. Now, there is one scenario within NRTP which has below a flat line in terms of traffic. It's called behaviour change. Now, what we've seen with the publication of the consultation on the National Networks Planning Policy Statement is a statement that continued absolute traffic growth is likely under all scenarios, and that's what National Highways should be seeking to plan for. So I think we can take that as a reading that we're at the very least cutting off this part of the road traffic futures in terms of what nationally Department for Transport thinks is reasonable to plan for, or which it is seeking to plan for through things like the National Planning Policy Statement for networks. So that's one key part of the dimensions which we can vary, and it looks like we're going for at least half of that ambition being cut away. If we then look at the technology pathways, these are the car and van technology pathways in terms of the percentage of miles which would be run in electric. So the very steep lines are the most ambitious part of the transport decarbonisation plan, and the dashed lines are the least ambitious part. Green is car, black is van. So you can see the very steep uptake by 2030 on the most ambitious scale. 50% of van and car miles are driven in electric, whereas at the least ambitious scale, it's 30% of car and about 15% of van. So the low ambition scale would be below what Ivo and Steve were pointing towards. Then we've seen the publication of the Zero Emission Vehicle Mandate consultation. So this is a second consultation, and it looks like the percentage sales of new electric vehicles has not substantially varied from the first round of the consultation. So I think broadly speaking, we can expect that to be what gets taken forward into legislation. So you can see the kind of step changes in the percentage of new car sales, which will be electric, and there's a similar chart for vans. I've developed a much less sophisticated stock model than Ivo had, which converts that into the proportion of the fleet which is electric, and I've calibrated that against what appears in the carbon budget delivery plan, and then converted that into a proportion of miles which are driven on electric. So as was pointed out, new vehicles tend to travel further than older vehicles, so you get more miles driven in electric than you have proportion of the fleet which is electric. So when you superimpose those lines onto what I showed you before, you get the zero emission vehicle mandate for cars in red and for vans in yellow, and you see that the car pathway is tracking just below or at the low ambition end of the transport decarbonisation plan, and the zero emission vehicle mandate for vans is tracking somewhere similar to cars, above what was assumed in the TDP, but well below the high ambition. So again, we've cut out this area of the ambition space. And what's important is I'm not criticising the zero emission vehicle mandate, but what it is doing is fixing down one of the key variables. So there's no point in pretending that we've got these very high vehicle emission scenarios out there that might save us when we're legislating for something which isn't going to deliver that. So just to put in context what the changes from the carbon budget delivery plan mean, if we look at the mitigation effort that the Committee on Climate Change expected in carbon budgets 4, 5 and 6, you can see technology was just over 3/4 at 697 megatons of carbon, whereas demand mitigation was 211 megatons of carbon. When you look at the carbon budget delivery plan, at the moment, the only thing that's quantified is 8.425 megatons of carbon. I'll come back to whether that could be greater in a couple of slides' time. So they're expecting a little bit more from technology, not just in surface transport, but elsewhere, but much, much less from demand mitigation. So what I've done then is to use my model to develop a series of tests of alternative approaches to see how close could we get to the 6 carbon budget, what would need to change now that we have more or less fixed down on our electrification pathway. So you can see at the very bottom there's the 6 carbon budget assumptions are used. The baseline model includes the National Road Traffic Projection core scenario, the zero emission vehicle mandate, and the calibrated vehicle efficiency. So that exceeds the budget by 220 megatons of carbon. That's 2 years at kind of more or less 2 years at current rates, but would be about 6 or 7 years worth of the back end of the budget. You can see the impacts of different traffic assumptions. I'll come on to those, and different efficiency assumptions. I'd just say that of the scenarios I looked at, there are only 3 that come close to meeting the 6 carbon budget. The first one is low traffic 20, which is a 20% reduction over the National Road Traffic Projection core scenario. So that's more or less flatlining in terms of traffic by 2030. Actually, it's just a little bit below that. And then the other 2, one is maximum TDP electric vehicle ambition, which, as Stephen Ivo's work showed, if you imagine much greater technology uptake, then you can still get close to the line. But we've legislated against that, so I put a red box around it. So we're not actually pursuing that. And the all-on policy pathway also included the max EV ambition, as well as low traffic 20 and ambitious vehicle efficiency. But again, we can't. We've taken legislative steps to kind of rule that out. So those pathways could still be available, but actually technologically not deliverable. So really the only thing that's on the deck there that works is something with some form of traffic reduction. So just to show you the numbers there, the baseline 224 megatons over. If we go higher than NRTP core, then an extra 10% or an extra 20%, you can see that begins to impact the numbers quite significantly. If we were to go 10% lower, it would be 102 megatons over the limit, but that's significantly closer. 20% still a slight exceedance, but nearly there. One thing I would say is there's, I think, hidden in the background of the TDP, some very ambitious assumptions about what happens to the efficiency of the fossil fuel vehicle fleet. If you assume no new vehicle efficiency rather than the levels which I worked out from calibrating my model, you get an additional 100 megatons of carbon. And in the zero emission vehicle mandate, there are options being consulted on which are to not mandate any improvements in existing vehicle efficiency. So we're relying on bits of biofuel improvement and some natural improvements from increasing electrification and management of engines, essentially, to deliver this. And there's quite a lot also assumed in vans and HGVs in terms of, I think, things like more efficient routing and loading. So I think there's quite a lot of this efficiency gain, which is also at risk in the plan at the moment. So implications, well, first thing to say is that transport ambitions being pushed elsewhere in the economy. So the whole of government approach to this will be to say, well, we are going to go slower, but don't worry, it'll be picked up elsewhere. Well, I think if you're in another sector, then I think you probably would be worried that we're being asked to pick that up elsewhere. But I also don't think it makes sense, as it's currently written, as a transport strategy, and I'll come on to that in my later bullets. The EV pathway is becoming more fixed, so in a sense we can worry less about the range of outcomes that on electrification sales that Ivo and Steve were talking about, and worry much more about the draw through on the fleet. And I mentioned significant uncertainty over efficiency gains, so I think there are real risks even in the plan that's set there at the moment. If we are to follow the 6 carbon budget from the Committee on Climate Change, then we will need traffic reduction versus National Road Traffic Projection core scenario. I've included all vehicle mileage, so that would be a reduction for light goods vehicles and heavy goods vehicles. If you don't want those to be reduced, then you're going to ask for more from car traffic. So that might be more in line with what we're seeing in the Scottish targets, for example. There is a suggestion that there will be more action taken by local transport plans, which will add to the mitigation effort. I'd like to see that being true, but what I haven't seen is any additional funding being announced for local transport planning relative to what's happened in previous decades. So for me, the level of funding and ambition that we're giving to local authorities is simply enough to keep up with the NRTP core traffic assumptions. If we want more mitigation, then we're going to have to put more resources in, take more difficult decisions, more powers, etc. for local action. So I'm not yet convinced that there will be significant additional local mitigation, which doesn't mean that I don't think it's important, but it just means that I don't think we've currently got the strategy there to support that. What we've got at the moment is going to bake in lower motoring costs. So electrification per mile will be cheaper for those people who are able to access it. That will undermine public transport, the competitiveness of public transport for some people, for some journeys, and it's going to create a big injustice on per mile costs. If you happen to be one of those people still owning and using a petrol vehicle in 2030, you're going to be paying 2 to 2.5 times per mile what somebody on a home charged electric vehicle is paying. So we know that, we're legislating for it. Are we going to allow that to unfold in front of us? As I say, I think there's a significant growing gap between local, regional, subnational ambition for transport and what's going on at a national scale, and I'll be interested to hear people's reflections on that.